Before starting this video, I'd like to ask you all to please go like the Prophet of Zod Facebook page. I'm going to be posting updates and announcements on upcoming projects there, and it will be a good place for general feedback and discussion. I've been collaborating with another YouTuber on a project that should be released next week, so if you want to see who the collaborator is and what we're doing, head on over. But for now, let's get on with the show.
Now, the storm itself has not really changed what it's doing. What has changed is our day-to-day assessment and projection.
When I was a young adult, and still a practicing Christian, the pastor of the church I'd grown up in experienced a sudden breakdown in both his mental faculties and his motor function. It was a jarring turn of events, and we were all both saddened and unnerved to see him deteriorate so quickly for reasons we, and even the doctors, could not fully understand. But what made it worse was the church's reaction to his condition. Many members were quick to appropriate it for the purpose of whatever spiritual narrative they currently embraced. Some viewed it as a demonic attack, while others saw it as a roadblock sent by God to test their faith. And notice I said test their faith, for in their minds this attack, or test depending on which contradictory interpretation they wanted to adopt, was targeted at the church, not just this pastor. And as the leader of the church, he bore the burden of recovering from, or continuing to suffer through, this event in a way that perpetuated the various narratives of spiritual warfare his members found satisfying. In the end, when he broke down and went to the Mayo Clinic for further help, a large part of his congregation expressed disappointment with him for his lack of faith, or for failing to trust God or stand up to the devil or whatever. It was a disgusting reaction to the suffering of a fellow human, and while many other Christians may have responded differently, this represents a problem that's inherent in all forms of fundamentalist Christianity, even in its most benign and intelligently practiced forms. By teaching that the universe is heavily influenced both by a benevolent God and evil demonic forces, it encourages them to invent superstitious interpretations of purely natural events, ultimately distracting them from intelligent behavior and encouraging bizarre, sometimes counterproductive reactions to the world around them. Rarely have I been as struck by the power of this mindset as in the last week when I saw my Facebook feed flooded, no pun intended, with Christian reactions to recent natural disasters. These reactions vary, of course, but in general they can be grouped into two bizarre yet totally contradictory interpretations, each of which serves the purpose of and reveals the mentality of whatever Christian adopted it. But given the slightest thought, neither makes any sense at all, and if anything, this storm has brought to light some basic absurdities in the thinking of Christians. The ugliest interpretation, of course, is that God sent these storms to punish our nation for its sin, usually for the sin of homosexuality because of course that's what it is. Now obviously we could rant and rave all day long about how ugly this response is, but I want to shift focus from that to the sheer stupidity of the idea. And I find that a good way to do so is to back up to square one and consider, first, what we might expect God would want to do at the beginning of the scenario, second, the options he would have at his disposal, and third, how he might ever plausibly proceed. According to Christians, God looked at the U.S. and decided he didn't like that a lot of people were being gay, and or doing some other sinful things, I guess. So naturally, he wanted to punish them. Now pause for a moment and consider all the different ways he could have done this. And while you're thinking, let's consider an analogous situation. When I was a principal and a group of students misbehaved, I would bring the students into my office and clearly communicate, in person, what they had done and what consequences were to follow. You know what I did not do? I didn't sneak out before recess and hide a hive of bees on a random place on the playground so that a random group of kids would get stung. Because that would be stupid, right? But that's exactly what Christians propose God is doing to the United States. Being all-powerful, he had every opportunity to grab the attention of our nation, as graphics like these say he was trying to do, in the most dramatic and obvious way imaginable. He could have appeared, announced who he was, and punished either the entire country or the most sinful regions in a way that even the most hardened atheist couldn't have denied, bringing us all to our knees and leaving us with no reasonable choice other than repentance. But instead, he chose to 1. send his punishment in the form of a naturally explainable weather pattern occurring when we most expected it. 2. Focus this punishment exclusively on communities that happen to fall within the likely path of hurricanes. And 3. Give us no indication, other than the highly speculative ramblings of Christian celebrities, that he was the one who did it. So what's more likely? This? Or that maybe, just maybe, hurricanes landed in a very predictable time and place, and that some people looked back and worked a supernatural explanation around these events? The answer is obvious, and obvious enough that we can move on to our second Christian response to the hurricane, which is praying for its victims. I think we've all seen images like these, which implore people to pray for various places in our nation struck by natural disaster. And while we as atheists might write off prayer as pointless, I can at least appreciate calls to prayer as a compassionate response to seeing people in need. But the problem is that it assumes all the love, care, and compassion must come from the people offering the prayer, leaving God as a sort of impersonal force that doesn't do anything until it's conjured by human rituals. In the Pray to Texas model, for example, it assumes that humans, triggered by compassion for flood victims, must pray to God who will then act. But why would God not be prompted into action by his own feelings of compassion? And what does it mean when he is not? This is a problem with prayer that we all understand, and that many Christians struggle with. But the dramatically documented events following these disasters make it that much more obvious, forcing us to confront the idea that God watched humans form a chain to rescue people from a swamped car and did nothing. That he watched humans tirelessly drive boats through dangerous waters to rescue those in need and did nothing. That he saw a family carrying children through floodwaters in hope of rescue and did nothing. The idea of prayer forces us to contrast the best of human heroism, offered at great risk and discomfort to those who stepped up to help others, with the cold indifference of a God who could solve all these problems with a blink of an eye but chooses not to. This guy's desire to help an elderly man did not depend on the prayers of people around the world. This guy would give no thought whatsoever to how many people were closing their eyes and muttering to him before climbing into his boat and risking his life for others. For humans to care about such triviality when others were in dire need would be monstrous. Yet Christians think it matters to God. For some reason, they think it's even possible that God might wait until a person in, say, Minnesota, starts praying before he decides whether or not to help a flood victim in Texas. They think he sits and watches as a hurricane approaches Florida, and it's only when a bunch of his followers sing and pray on a beach that he changes his mind and, well, he doesn't make the storm disappear as much as, make it change course and cause slightly less destruction somewhere else? It's clear that Christians are just interpreting the normal behavior of a hurricane to suit their needs. While the real assholes interpret the storm itself as God's punishment, the nicer Christians interpret its normal wind-down pattern as being a sign that he answered their prayers. But in both cases, as in the case of my old pastor, all we have is Christians whose response to danger and suffering, and sometimes their empathy for others, is horribly misguided by a superstitious interpretation of obviously natural events.
Now, the storm itself has not really changed what it's doing.
Who is worthy? None beside me, God Almighty.
What has changed is our day-to-day assessment and projection